It's time to guide the transmission back to the engine. If everything's lined right, it should slide right together. You could put a little grease on these dowel pins if you're worried about it, or if it was galled up pretty bad. But everything's torqued down. If your drive axle's still sticking through, and you start putting a transmission against the motor, feed it into the differential housing so it doesn't tear up the seal. It's just a little filler, it's not too hard to put together. Just set the front on the jack and put a 2-to-4 on the frame, and the back of the transmission just kind of work it over. It's almost together. I'm going to go ahead and put this longer 14mm into the dowel pin behind this engine mount. Just wiggle it on over. Make sure your drive axle is starting in the differential if you got it still in there. Just as a general rule for this, I work on your dowel pin bolts first to get those lined up and the transmission centered. And once you get the bottom together, the top will follow suit. Went ahead and tightened my 14mm dowel pin bell housing bolts. One in the rear above the drive shaft and one through this engine mount in the front behind the radiator. Once you got those two tightened down and the transmission's flat, you can go ahead and put the rest of the bell housing bolts in. Don't forget that the back bell housing bolt has a ground wire underneath of it, an eyelet. I'm going to go ahead and engage this throwout bearing to the pressure plate. There it is, in business. It's locked on. If you don't hear a click, you got a problem. It only moves a little bit after it's locked on. So the give for the clutch to wear, and then that's the apply. And it's pushing, it's lifting the clutch web fingers up, and that's releasing the clutch fingers. But if it goes on, you got a problem. But I don't have a problem, so I'm good to go to put the rest of the bolts back in. With the two dowel pin bolts tightened down, and this top 17mm in the front is tightened down, I'm going to go ahead and feed the starter and wiring back around in behind the engine and stick the starter back in its hole, and tighten this 17mm down with the ground cable under it. Went ahead and bolted the starter on with the two 14mm bolts, about 2.5 inches long. Ground cable's bolted on, the top two 17mm bell housing bolts are tight. Went ahead and installed the shifter linkage, lubricated it up, this block and these pins. Put the washer and clip back on. This arm will need lubed up, and that hinge point there. I'm going to jack the transmission up level, like in line with putting the rear mount back on it. Those 3 bolts, and then the 4 bolts in the body here. I'm just jack it up level. Now I'm going to stick the drive axles back in it. This Just line your axle up and give it a good shove in there until it stops, and then give it a little tugging back at the transaxle and make sure it's locked on, that it doesn't come back out, but pull it at the CVC joint housing, not on the axle itself. Now I've got the transaxle sealed up. Both axles are back in it. I'm going to pour it takes 75/90 weight. I'm using synthetic grease. I think there's an update to use 75/85 if you want to go that route. But I'm going to use this reverse switch hole for a fill area instead of pumping it in the fill plug down on the side down there. I'll just pour it through this backup light switch hole. Save making a mess and pumping it in the front. This system holds 2 1/4 quarts of 75/90. I can sit there and drain, or you can force it in as much as it'll take, provided it don't run over. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like it'll take as much as I can put to it. I'll just let it sit there and drain. I'm not in any hurry for it. Go on to bigger and better things. Put this spindle back to the strut with the mounting bolts. They torque to 100 foot-pounds, thereabout. Okay, I've put 2.25 quarts of 75/90 synthetic grease in this. And I had the fill plug out and I was checking it, and I was getting a little response from the grease flowing out of it. So I'm going to leave it at that. Put this backup switch in there and put this rear engine mount back on the body. This backup switch takes a 24mm socket to install it. Before putting grease in their transmission, make sure the drain plug's tight on it. It'll go right out the bottom. I'm going to be adding blue Loctite to these 3 bolts that pass through this mount and go into the aluminum, and a little more reliable and help lubricate the threads and help retain the bolts in the aluminum. I'm going to run these 3 mount bracket bolts down to 50 foot-pounds. Then these body bolts run down to 45 foot-pounds. This through bolt nut tightens down to 70 foot-pounds. I went ahead and plugged the speed sensor electrical connector in down the back of the transmission, and the backup light switch underneath the transmission rear mount. I went down underneath. I'm going to put the frame bolt back in the front and get it hand started. Tighten this bolt down to 125 foot-pounds. I'll tighten this back frame nut up to 100 foot-pounds, and then the 14mm on that triangular plate to 45 foot-pounds. Now that the frame bolts are tightened back up, I'm going to install this rear transmission roller mount and the front roller mount loosely, then tighten them down once they're both installed. Both mounts are installed. and the 3 bolts are in there. These bolts torque to 45 foot-pounds, 50, and the screw bolt 45, 50 pounds, 50 pounds preferably. Same with the front one. Make sure your axles are seated. Try to push out on them. They shouldn't move. Once your mounts are installed, go ahead and put the rest of your bell housing bolts back in. There's 3 of them, 14 millimeter. And tighten them down to about 35, 40 foot-pounds. Now that the underneath work's done, at least directly underneath the slave cylinder, I'm going to install the new slave cylinder and bleed it. Since the work's done underneath, I won't have to lay in a puddle of brake fluid from bleeding this thing. This is a new slave cylinder. I pulled this clevis off. I'm going to put some grease on the end of this pin and down into this piston. And then I'm going to push the piston all the way against the back and pour brake fluid while easing the piston and back out and fill this thing full of brake fluid. Just to save a little bit of effort. Be careful the spring and restrictor doesn't fall out of the end of it where that banjo fitting screws on. I don't think the restrictor is that relevant. You could leave it out, but I'm not an engineer, so use what it's equipped with, I guess. I'm going to go ahead and break the banjo fitting loose on this slave cylinder down here and do it up above the master cylinder, and I won't lose so much brake fluid. It's a 12 millimeter bolt in the banjo fitting. The line goes up through those 2 reliefs cut out in it. This one's full of fluid now. Be sure and keep the brake fluid off your paint job, it'll mess it up. At least have a towel over this fender. It can get everywhere. Go ahead and fill your reservoir up. I went ahead and greased this clevis pin hole and bleed it if you need to. Tighten your line down to about 12 foot-pounds, 15, 12. Install your clevis pin and clip. Let's see if it's working. That worked good. It's installed. Go ahead and clip your wire harnesses back in if you got them. Most of this top work's done. It's time to put the spindles back together with the struts and the tie rod in. Now to stick the axle in the spindle and push it up into the strut. Put those 17 millimeter bolts in. They torque to 100 foot-pounds. Go ahead and install your brake caliper hanger and or brake caliper. These bolts tighten to 60 foot-pounds. Install your caliper brake hose hold down bracket with a 12 millimeter bolt. Then Then install your tie rod in, 17mm nut, torque it to 20 to 25 foot-pounds, and install the split pin, quarter pin, whatever you want to call it. Go ahead and install your splash shield up in between the transmission and the wheel. Tighten this axle nut down to 180 foot-pounds. You can either hold the brake or stick a punch in, blow the brake caliper, whatever. And insert the split pin, quarter pin into this nut. Put your wheels on, tighten the lug nuts to a maximum of 80 foot-pounds. Ready to go home. One clutch job, 2 lug nut studs, new slave cylinder, 2 1/4 or 2 1/2 quarts of 75/90, 1 wheel bearing.